Working at Starbucks in Florida, I used to think the worst thing I had to deal with was the humidity. That was until we decided to clean out some of the empty boxes in the back of the store. It was something we had been putting off all year, but it was a fairly simple task. We were just going to make sure that the boxes were empty, break them down, and then bring them out with the trash. So we waited until it was a slow time in the day, and it was my job to start breaking down the boxes. Most of them were empty, aside from a few plastic bags or pieces of tape. But as I worked my way to the back of the pile, I could swear that I heard something. It almost sounded like someone had dropped a bunch of tiny objects on the floor. It's hard to describe. I was curious, but a bit put off by the sound. I continued breaking down the boxes. Only now, I was taking my time because the closer I got to the bottom of the pile and the wall, the louder and more constant the noise got. Finally, I was down to the final box, and I have to admit, I was terrified to see what was making that noise. I really didn't want it to be cockroaches at the time, but looking back on it, that wouldn't have been nearly as bad. I reached my hand down and ever so slightly touched the box, and before I could even get a grip on it, I realized what the sound was. I pulled my hand away, and as I did, the box shifted in place, pouring out from inside of the supposedly empty box, and all around it were tiny black and red spiders that began to scatter all over the place. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran through the store. My manager asked me what was wrong, and I let her know that I was fairly certain that there was a nest of black widow spiders in the back of the store. We all began to freak out, and one of the other guys working was brave enough to go and take a look and make sure I wasn't going crazy. He walked back so fast and told our boss that we needed an exterminator. We all evacuated the store and waited for someone to come to check out the situation. The exterminator showed up and let us know that the store would have to be closed for the next week while fumigating it. He said that he had never seen an infestation like that, and it's amazing that no one had seen them sooner. There must have been 200 or more little but very deadly spiders in the store with us for months. We never put off breaking down the boxes ever again. That's the first thing we do now after processing our shipments. When I was 17, I got my first job at a Starbucks down the street from my house. I ended up working there for about 3 years. It was a pretty standard job. Some days were worse than others, but that really depended on the mood of my coworkers and the customers. But all in all, it was a decent first job. There was only one instance where things got pretty bizarre, and I'm sure I would have been more shaken up by the event if it happened to me, but I was merely a witness. You see, it was just after my second year working in the store, and I had actually earned a promotion to assistant manager. Not much changed about my day-to-day job except I had a few more responsibilities. I showed up to work one afternoon and saw that there were only 2 people working, which was odd because we typically had at least 3 people in the store at all times. One to work the drive-thru, one to work the counter, and one to help maintain the flow of the food and drinks being made. I asked if anyone had left early, but apparently someone had just decided to do a no-call, no-show. It wasn't a big deal, but it meant I was busy getting caught up with some things that were supposed to have been done that day. I told Mackenzie that I needed her on the drive-thru and Darren was at the counter, and for the most part, we got everything running smoothly again. However, about an hour into my shift, I noticed Mackenzie was standing away from the window and looked a bit on edge, so I approached her and asked her if everything was all right. That was when she let me know that she just got a little creeped out by a customer. She said a man in a gray SUV asked her what time she got off, and she was just a bit uncomfortable. I asked if she wanted to go on a break, but she said she was fine and got back to work. Less than a minute later, I can see Mackenzie signaling Darren to come over to her, so I joined the both of them near the window. She pointed to the camera at the drive-thru window and said that the same SUV was pulling through again. I asked if they forgot anything, and she said, "No, They just ordered a cake pop and said they couldn't wait to see me. This time, I decided to handle the order. I grabbed the man's food and met him at the window. He seemed surprised to see me instead of Mackenzie, and when I handed him his cake pop, he just snatched it and drove off. About 45 minutes went by, and we had finally finished talking about how weird the situation was. I needed to handle a bit of paperwork, so I told the two of them to come get me if they need help or anything, and then I went into the office. About 10 minutes after that, I hear Mackenzie screaming, but not in fear. No, she sounded aggressively angry. I ran out of the office to see what was going on, and right away I could tell what was going on. The man in the SUV came back, and this time Mackenzie was infuriated by it. I began to walk over to them and try to defuse the situation, and Mackenzie noticed and looked toward me. That was when I saw the man reach out of his car and into the drive-through window. He grabbed Mackenzie and began pulling her, trying to force her out of the window and into his car. Darren and I sprinted to the window and both grabbed Mackenzie. As soon as he lost grip on her, he leaned back into his car and sped off. Mackenzie was terrified, and rightfully so. He almost had her out of the window, and if that had happened, we may not have been able to get her back. We called the police and gave them our security footage. For the rest of the time that I worked there, we made sure that Mackenzie never worked the drive-through window again. The city that I lived in when I was in my 20s had a few Starbucks shops placed throughout it, but I happened to work at the only one that was open past 9 p.m. The store that I worked at would be open until midnight, and we happened to also be right next to the hospital, which meant between the hours of 9 p.m. and midnight, we typically saw quite a bit of foot traffic and people ordering coffees. So one night, when it was just me and the manager on duty were working, it was about 11:55, and we were getting ready to lock up when we noticed a car pull into the parking lot. So I got behind the register and ready to take any orders that were about to come in, while the manager continued to wipe down the tables and get things ready for closing. Two men came into the store and made their way up to the counter. I asked them if I could take their order, and as I went to make the one coffee that they wanted, I felt something hard hit me in the back of the head. I stumbled forward, and before I could turn around, one of the men was already over the counter and pointing a gun in my face. I couldn't see what was happening. All I could hear was the manager struggling and what sounded like loud banging. After a moment, the man who was attacking my manager made his way around the counter and joined his partner in pointing a gun at my head. I begged and pleaded with them not to hurt me, and they told me that all they wanted was what we had in the register. I told them I would comply, and slowly stood and began to enter my employee code to open the register as if I were making a transaction. They grabbed the money and then asked me where the freezer was. I was confused but showed them to the walk-in freezer. They told me to get in and drop down to my knees. They said to count to 100 and then I could come out. I began counting, but I only made it to 3 before I heard the sound of a gunshot and everything went dark. I don't know how, but after a moment of darkness, suddenly I could see again. I was laying in a pool of blood. I knew I had gotten shot, I just didn't know where. I did my best to stagger out of the walk-in freezer and made my way over to the phone to call the police and an ambulance. First responders were arrived and surprised I was able to move. Little did I know at the time, I had gotten shot in the back of the head and somehow managed to stay conscious. Everything after that, and up until I woke up in a hospital bed, was a blur. I ended up needing multiple surgeries. And as for my manager, he had gotten beaten severely by the man who attacked him while he was straightening up. He was in a medically induced coma for 3 weeks before he finally woke up. At the end of the day, aside from some nerve damage, the two of us miraculously made it out alive.